Hey guys, and welcome to episode 4 of the Inventory Remake 2024 series. In this episode, we're going to start off with fixing a small little error I made in the last episode. And then we're going to get to setting up a system for getting the inventory data from the client side so that the client can also access all the stacks and everything, which is going to be important for actually displaying the inventory in the actual inventory GUI. And then from that, we're going to move on to actually working with the client to get that set up and programming the GUI. So getting started, go to Replicated Storage, Modules, Types. Go to the hotbar type and change slot 0 to slot 10. Just kind of make it clearer that this is the 10th slot. It's not a huge deal, but I think it's a little easier to understand that way. So then now we're going to go over to Server Script Service, Server, Inventory Server. This is the script we were working in last episode. We're going to move down to right above here and create a new function. We're going to do function inventory server dot get inventory data player as a player type. So this function is going to take in the player to get the inventory data for, and it's going to return the inventory of that specific player. And we're mostly just going to use this for connecting it with this signal module in order to access inventory data from the client side. So what we're going to do, we're going to wait for the inventory in case it hasn't loaded yet, in case that the player is just joined the game, maybe it hasn't loaded yet. So we're going to do while not inventory server.all inventories player do task.wait end. So this is essentially going to check, okay, is there an inventory for this specific player? If there is, just don't even run this. If there isn't, since there's a not here, then we're going to run test.wait, and we're going to do that repeatedly until this returns false, in which case we then move on. So then we're going to do local, so then all we're going to do is just return inventory server, all inventories player. So it's a pretty simple function. So now, in order to actually listen to this from the inventory client, we're going to have to connect this with the signal module. So we're going to have to require that. So local signal equals require rs.modules.signal. And that's this module right here. And so this essentially is going to replace remote events. I mean, it uses remote events internally, but it'll make it a little bit easier syntactically and also just kind of for convenience, so we don't have to create remote events for everything we need to do between the client and the server. So we're going to be using this, and you can do it without using this module too. It doesn't matter too much. So just above the game shutdown, it doesn't matter too much if it's above or below, but we're going to put it above. I'm going to create a new section, signal events, and then I'm going to do signal.listen remote inventory server get inventory data. And that's going to be the key that we'll need to fire on the client to actually run the function we're about to insert here. So then the next argument is going to be inventory server dot get inventory data. And make sure you don't call the function, make sure you just have the name like this. And so now this will take the get inventory data function we just created, and it's going to directly connect it to this signal key. So now if we fire or if we invoke this signal key from the client, it's going to run this function, get the return value, and return that through the remote function that it uses to do the invoke. So now we have most of the server side set up for the basic structure of the inventory and everything. Now we're going to get started on the actual client side of things. So we have this local script and starter player scripts client, and this is going to be where everything starts, similar to this server script right here. And then we're going to do most of our code in this inventory client module script. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do local inventory client equals require script.inventory client, right? Then we're going to do inventory client dot start, same way as we did in this script right here. So then in inventory client, we want to open this, and right now it's just an empty table, it doesn't actually do anything. So we're going to want to rename this. So I'm going to do module equal inventory client equals an empty table, returning into the client. So basically the same thing as before. Then we're going to add the start function. And so now this function is going to be ran from this script, and this is where all of our starting code is going to happen. Okay, so now just to test that this is working, add quick print. And this should run right at the start of the game when we first load our character in. We can see that it prints right here. If yours doesn't print, make sure you double check that you have this line right here and that this script is running. So now we're going to define some services that we'll need, as well as some modules. Services, local, we're going to need the player service. We're going to need user info service. We're going to need replicated storage. Starter GUI. And then we're also going to need the tween service. So players, we're going to use that to get the actual local player and everything. User input service, we're going to use that to get, user input for selecting the slots and whatnot. Replicated storage, that just has some things that we'll need to access, like these modules. Starter GUI, we're going to use this to disable the default backpack GUI. And then tween service, we're going to use this to do some special animations and effects with GUI. So now we're going to require some modules, pretty much the same ones as before. So we're going to require the janitor module and the signal module. Then we're going to define some extra variables for the player as well as for the UI. So we define the player as a variable, and we're also defining the player GUI as a variable, because originally you put all your GUI in this service called starter GUI, but when you actually run the game, it takes all that GUI, it copies and pastes it into each individual player's player GUI. So we want to work with the GUI in here rather than the GUI in starter GUI. So now we're going to define variables based on that for all of the GUI objects we'll be needing to reference. So make sure for each of these variables, make sure you use wait for child, because a lot of times local scripts, so essentially this script, a lot of times they run before the GUI is fully loaded in, so you almost always need to use wait for child. Okay, so I've defined a lot of variables here, and so most of them, they're all just references to the different GUI objects here, and we're just using them for convenience's sake, so we don't have to do like GUI dot this dot item sample just to get this item sample, right? So this one's the actual GUI itself, and we have the hotbar frame, inventory frame, the open button, which we've just called env, and then the error text. And I also have a bit of a naming convention here, where I do a brief summary of the name, and then I do in capital letters like the acronym for what type of object it is. So F here stands for frame, B stands for button, T stands for text, down here SF stands for scrolling frame. It's just something I do sometimes. I don't do it always, like right here I didn't add it, but I feel like it helps with clarity for what the variables actually are, especially if you have two different GUI variables that have the same name but reference different types of objects that can help kind of differentiate them. So we have all these, which is just these 4 items, right? That's what these are. And then inside the inventory frame, we have the info F, which is the item info. And inside that is where we have a bunch of other stuff, which we've defined variables for here. And then also inside inventory F, we have the item scrolling frame, which we have the sample inside, which we've defined here, because we're going to need to copy that, so we're going to want direct access to that, or a direct reference to that, rather. And we also have the same sort of thing for the armor, where we have some stuff for that. So now we're going to add a couple little things. Some of these items, some of these GUI objects, we want them to be invisible by default. For example, if I go over to this inventory right here, and I check visible is true, you can see there's all this stuff. We don't want all this visible by default, right? Especially like, this error text, for example, right? We don't want that visible when they first start the game. We want that to only pop up when they get an error message. So what I like to do is on these same lines, for the objects I want to start as being invisible or start as being visible, I like to add a semicolon, so then I can add another statement on the same line. So I can do invf.visible equals false, right? So that way, even if you have this enabled, I'm going to disable this, even if you have this enabled, then when you run the game, it's going to disable it. And you can see now it's not visible. So that way, if you're like modifying the UI and you forget to like make it invisible before publishing your game or something, then you don't end up with like a weird bug where the UI starts off being open. Then we're also going to do that same thing for the error text. And just as a quick clarification, using this semicolon is the same as just doing a separate line. I'm just using the semicolon to be more concise and have it on the same line. Control F dot visible equals false. Instruct t dot visible equals false. Sample dot visible also equals false. So those are all the things we're going to want to disable by default. We want to disable the inventory frame. I already explained why. The error text, kind of the same sort of thing. The info frame, we're going to have the info frame, which is this part, only show up when you have an item selected, so we don't want that to be enabled by default. And then instruction text, also we only want that to show up when you actually need to see that. And then the item sample, we want this to be always invisible because we're going to create clones of this sample. Where is it? We're going to create clones of this sample, but we don't want to actually see the original sample itself. But so if, say we had a bunch of these, right? These ones are all like the actual items themselves. Then this one's the sample. If we make the sample invisible, it just moves the items over, and so it lets us use the same sort of grid layout while having the sample in the same directory. Kind of makes it a little bit easier to work with. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up opening and closing of the actual inventory GUI. I'm going to disable this just so it's not in the way. In order to do this, we're going to add we're going to define some values inside the inventory client table. So inventory client dot open position is equal to invf dot position. So this is going to be the position it's at by default, right? So right now we have it in the position we want it to be when the inventory is open. And so that's how we're going to configure that. And we're going to do inventory client dot close position equals invf dot position plus udim2 dot from scale 0,1. And so what this means, so we take the inventory's current position and then we add a scale of like vertically the whole screen size, moving it down that much, I guess. So I guess just to kind of like visualize better, that was kind of confusing. So the position right now is at 0.5, 0.5, and that's using scale. And that puts it at, on the x-axis, it's halfway across the screen. On the y-axis, it's halfway down the screen, because x goes to the right, y goes down. But if we added 1 to this y, then suddenly it's not visible, right? I mean, even if we had this on, right? We just have 0.5, we can see it. We do 1.5, we can't see it. And that's because it's down below the screen. So if I did like 0.9, we can see it. If I did 1, we can still kind of see it. But if we add the full 1 to the original 0.5, then it makes so we know for sure that that object is not visible anymore. And so that's going to essentially move the GUI below where you can actually see it. And that's going to be the position the inventory is at when it's closed. If you want the inventory to open from the top, you'd do -1. And if you wanted to open from the right, you would do +1 on the x-axis, -1 would be the left, but I'm going to do it from the bottom. Then I'm going to do inventory client dot open close debounce equals false. Inventory client dot, made a slight typo here. Inventory client dot is open is equal to false as well. So now what we're going to do, before we get to the opening and closing, I forgot that we also need to disable the default GUI. Because we can see we still have all this default GUI and it's kind of in the way, right? We don't want to use that, we want to use our own GUI. So we're going to do one quick line. We're going to do starter GUI, set core GUI enabled, enum.core GUI type.backpack. And then we're going to do comma false. And that will disable this specific core GUI, which is the inventory. Now if we run it, we can see that we no longer have the inventory. We still have the backpack here, but it just doesn't show the GUI anymore. So now we're going to we're going to define a function that we'll use for opening and closing inventory GUI. So we're going to call the function inventory client dot set window open. And so you could use like an open function and a close function, but sometimes I like to just have them both in one function. And we can have toSet as a boolean. And that's going to be what we want to set it to. So if we do set window open true, it'll open the window. If we do set window open false, it'll close it. So then we can use the same debounce variable here and say if inventory client dot open close debounce, then return end. And then inventory client dot open close debounce equals true. And then at the very end, inventory client dot open close debounce equals false. And so what this is going to do is we're going to have a bunch of code here, right? And then so when we run this function, it's going to set open close debounce to true. And our code, it might have delays in it, right? Because we're going to be doing like tweens to like animate the GUI and have it, instead of just teleporting up and teleporting back down, it's going to like smoothly move up and then it's going to move back down, right? So that's going to take up time, and therefore we don't want to have some issues happen if we run this function while it's currently running. And so that's what this debounce is going to be for. If we set this to true, then we try running it again while this is still true, it won't do anything. It'll just return and then it'll skip it, right? But then if we wait long enough for this to then turn false again, it'll allow us to run this function again. So we're essentially adding a cooldown to the set window open function. So then checking toSet, we're going to do if toSet equals true, then, and then we're going to do else. And so if it's true, that means we want to open the GUI. We're going to do inf.position equals to inventory client dot close position. And so this is just to ensure, since we're opening the GUI, we want to make sure it starts in the closed position rather than in the open position. And then we're going to do inf.visible equals true, in case it wasn't already visible, right? And especially because we turned it invisible at the start of the game. So we know it's not going to be visible when you first start the game. So then we also, now that the inventory is set to visible and it's under the screen where they still can't see it, now we're going to use the function tween position to tween the inventory onto the center of the screen, into the open position. So we're going to do inv tween position. Okay, so we're going to do inventory f tween position, and we're going to set the new position to be the open position. As you can see, there's the parameters here: end position, easing direction, easing style, and then the time, and then I'm not sure what this is. Override, callback, bunch of stuff. But we're only going to be using, we're not going to be using those last two for this. So now we need to define the easing direction. I'm just going to do out, and then I'm going to do enum.easingStyle.chord, because chord works pretty good for GUI movements. And then for the time, I'm going to do half of a second. And there's all kinds of different easing styles. You can kind of play around with them. If you just do enum.easingStyle, then you add a period, you can kind of see them all and you can kind of look at them. I'm going to be using quart. You can use a different one if you want to. And we're going to do task.wait for half a second to wait for the tween to complete. And then inventory client.isOpen equals true. So now at this point, the inventory is in fact open because we've waited for the tween, and the tween has tweened it to the open position. So then for the closing portion, when we want to close the inventory and it's already open, we're going to do inf tween position, inventory client.close position, enum.easingDirection.in this time instead of out, and enum.easingStyle.chord, 0.5. And then we're going to wait half a second. Then we're going to set inf.visible equals to false. And this isn't like super important because the inventory is not already going to be not visible because it's under the screen. But I've gotten into the habit of setting windows to false, or Windows visible property to false, even when they're off the screen, just in case there's like little bits and pieces that aren't off the screen. And so this is kind of a little safety check. So then I'm going to set inventory client.isOpen equals false. And so now we can use this as open value right here in order to check when if the inventory is currently open or not, which will be useful later on. But right now, so we've defined this function. It looks pretty good, but we don't have anything that actually runs this function. And so now we need to connect input to actually run this function. And the two ways I plan on doing this is, for one thing, keyboard users or computer users can press the B key to open the inventory. B stands for bag, right? And then I also want to make so you can also press this button to open the inventory. So yeah, so we're going to connect the B key to open the inventory, and we're also going to connect this button to open and close the inventory. I'm going to start off by setting up the B key. So we're going to create a new function. Function inventory client dot on input began input object, and then game process event is a boolean. And so this, we're just going to directly connect this to the user input service dot input began event. So we're going to do that up here. UIS dot input began connect inventory client dot input began, or dot on input began, and we're just going to directly connect this function to this event. So this will run on whenever this event happens, and that'll give us the input and the game processed event from this event. And so now game processed event it's kind of hard to really explain, but essentially it's if you have some sort of input and it's processed by some kind of GUI in Roblox, then we want to ignore that input. So like, for example, if you go here into the chat and you press the B key, we don't want it to open the backpack when you're typing in the chat, right? Because that would just be kind of inconvenient and confusing. So that's what game processed event lets us check. So if game processed event, then return end, because we don't want to include those inputs. And then we're going to check that the input was actually the B key. So we're going to do open close if input.keycode equals enum.keycode.b. Then inventory client dot set window open, not inventory client dot is open. And so what this is going to do, so it's going to listen for the B key. Anytime the key B is pressed, then it's going to trigger input began, and then we're going to check that this is in fact the B key that was just pressed from this input object right here. And then it's going to run our set window open function with the argument not inventory client dot is open. And so inventory client dot is open is either true or false. Not is going to be the opposite of that. So that's kind of how that works. So if it's open, so then is open would be true, then not is open is going to be false, and vice versa. So if we test this, press B, it opens. If we press B again, it closes. And you can see it also made all this other stuff invisible because we set that in all these lines right here. And if you see, we can even spam it, and since we have that debounce in there, it doesn't break anything if we spam the B key. And so now the next thing, we need to connect the button to the same event, essentially, right? Or to the same function. So we're going to do inv button dot mouse button one click connect function, and then we're going to need to define a separate function. Like right here, we just connected it directly to the function definition we already have, but in this case, we need to run the set window open function. So inventory client dot set window open, and with the same thing as before, inverting whether or not it's currently open. And so the reason we need to have this separate function is because we need to actually add this argument, and having like a nested function is the only way we can do that. But this should, whenever you press the inventory button, it should connect it to run this, which should do the same thing as when you press the B key. So now you can see if I press this bag button, it does the same exact thing. So now that we have opening and closing the inventory set up, now we're just going to do some setup code for the other buttons as well. If we go and run the game, we open up our inventory. Actually, we can't see it. So instead, if we make the inventory visible, we go to items info, we have this drop button and this equip button. So we're going to connect those to their own individual functions that we want to run whenever those are pressed. And we're not going to do anything in those yet because we need to define a lot of other stuff before we can define that logic. But we're just going to set that up now just to kind of save some time later. So right here, we're going to do connecting buttons, equip button, mouse button one click connect function. Or actually, we're going to define the function, so let's go do that. So under here, equip button, function inventory on equip button, and then we're going to do print equip button pressed. I'm going to do another one for the drop button. print drop button pressed. So we're going to connect this. So equip button connected to inventory client dot on equip button, then drop button connected to inventory client dot on drop button. And so in order to test this, like I showed before, if you run it, then we don't see this frame, so we're going to need to remove the line that makes that invisible just for now. So I'm going to comment that out. And then now we can see this, and so if we go to the output, we press equip, we can see it prints that, just so we know that now it is detecting the input correctly. And then I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add that line back. So now that we have kind of some of the basic GUI programming set up, now we're going to set up a function for actually getting the inventory server's inventory data, so we can actually have that on the client and update the actual UI to show the items in the actual inventory, the hotbar, all that sort of stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new value here, inventory client dot in data equals nil by default, because we don't have the data yet. And then we're going to create a new function at the very bottom. It's going to be a pretty simple function. It's going to be called inventory client dot update inventory data. And then we're going to do inventory client dot in data is equal to so we have this signal module, and this is where we're going to use this, right? So if you remember, on the server we also are using the signal module, and we did listen remote with this specific key, right? So we're going to copy that, and then over here we're going to do so inventory client dot in data equals signal dot invoke server, so that way we can get the return value from the server, and then we're going to paste that same string we just copied. So inventory server get inventory data, and this is going to run this function, or it's going to run the inventory server get inventory data function, right? And one nice thing about this is all we have to do. We don't have to provide the argument, because if we look over here, right, it has the player argument. That's the argument that it needs. But since we're using a remote function to do this, it already has the player argument by default, because it just uses the current player that just fired, right? Or the current player that just invoked the server. So it's already going to provide the player, so we don't need to provide that separately. And so this function, anytime we run this function, it will update this value to have the current inventory data. And so on that note, updating inventory, we're just going to run that function, right? Update inventory data. And so now, if we do print inventory client, which we're going to print the entire module, right, after we update it, and then we can kind of look at it. So we have inventory client, we have inventory data right here, and now you can see rather than being nil like we started it off as right here, now it actually has some data. And that data, it shows there's nothing in the armor, there is stuff in the hotbar, and there is a bunch of stuff in the inventory, and it's all the same stuff that we saw on the server, right? So we know that it's working correctly. And notice we also even have the references to the individual tools, and that's just kind of a nice thing that Roblox Studio has in place, where if you send a reference to a tool from the server to the client, it'll maintain that reference, or essentially like kind of use the client's own reference to that, but it translates that correctly. So that's nice. So now we're getting to the actual displaying the inventory's data, right? So this is going to be the kind of a big portion of this. We're going to create a new function under here, updating inventory, or updating display, function inventory client dot update display. And so similar to how we had this set window open function set up, we're going to create a new debounce variable, because we don't want to update the display while it's currently being updated, because that could possibly lead to some bugs. I'm also going to remove this print, we don't need that anymore. So up here at the very top, I'm going to do inventory client dot updating debounce is equal to false, same as open close debounce. But this we're going to do just a little bit differently. So rather than simply returning if the debounce is currently true, we're actually going to wait for the debounce to be false. So that way, essentially, it's like if you run the function once, so update display is currently running, maybe it has some kind of delay that causes it to take more than one frame to run, and then you try running it again while it's still running, it's going to repeatedly wait until it finishes running the first time, and then it's going to run again the second time. And that's to prevent an issue where maybe the server sends a message to the client that it needs to update its data because there's a new tool or something, right? And then as the client's updating its data, the server sends another message that it needs to update its data again because of another new tool. We don't want to just skip that update because that might be important information that the client would then miss. So we're going to do while inventory client dot updating debounce do test.wait, and so that's going to repeatedly wait until the debounce is false, and then it's going to still run the same function. Inventory client dot updating debounce equal to true, and then inventory client dot updating debounce equals false. So now, the first thing we want to do for this inventory system, for the client side, is we want to display all the items, right? So there's kind of a list of things we need to do. We need to display the items in the inventory, we need to display the items in the hotbar, we need to display the items in the armor, and then we need to have the system set up so that we can actually equip items using the buttons and drop items also using the buttons. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up actually showing the items that we have in this inventory right here. So in order to do that, we're gonna because we're gonna imagine, right? We're gonna run this function anytime we want the display to be updated to match whatever the server shows, right? And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna check inside this item scrolling frame if there's any items that are currently in here other than the sample, then we want to get rid of those and then just replace them with new ones. So we're gonna essentially clear everything out and then add them back in again, and that'll essentially just fully update whatever items are. And that will fully update whatever items are currently in the inventory. That way we don't have any issues with like some items being removed when they're not supposed to be, or items that are supposed to be removed that don't get removed. So this is essentially going to be like a refresh function. So we're going to do clearing items, item F, which is a frame, and items get children. We're going to take the scrolling frame, that's right here. We're going to get all the children in the scrolling frame. We're going to do if item f dot class name equal to image button. We can see, okay, we need to do text button instead, because we see the sample is a text button as it shows right here. So we want to only loop through the text buttons. We don't want to include this UI grid layout, for example, right? And item f is not equal to item sample, because we also don't want to remove this sample. We want to leave this here. So that's just going to be invisible and just going to kind of stay there throughout the entire game. And then we're going to do item f destroy if both of these conditions are met. So that's going to clear out all the items, right? And then we're also going to after we're clearing everything out, we're then going to create the new items. So creating item frames just based on what the inventory data currently shows. So I'm going to do local inventory, and we're also going to go up here, right? We're going to require this types module again, so we can access the types definitions. Local types equals require set modules types. And then we're going to do inventory. It's going to be of type types dot inventory, and it's going to be equal to inventory client dot in data. So we're going to do for icon of stack data types dot stack data in dot inventory do. And so now we're looping through all the stacks in the inventory on the client side, and we're going to create a clone of the sample right here. We're going to create a clone of this sample text button for every item, for every stack that we have in the inventory. So local item f equals item sample clone. We're going to do item f dot name equal to stack dot stack data dot stack ID. And that's just kind of to be able to see it as we're actually looking at it, so we can kind of know what item or what image button represents what stack. And then, but that's not necessarily important to the actual functioning of the system. Item f dot image stack data dot image. So we're going to show the actual image. So if we look at this, right, we have this thing. So we're going to change this actually. So it's item f dot image because we have a text button, and it has an image label inside of it called image, and we want to set the image property of this image label to then be stackData.image, which is a string. So that's going to update, it's going to create a new sample, and it's going to update the image to show the image for the item. So then itemF.count.text is equal to stackData.items. Then we're going to put a little hashtag before it, which is say the number of stackData.items. So essentially the length of the amount of items. So this is just the amount of items, right, in that stack. Then .x. So it's like if we have 5 items, it would be 5 times, or 5x. Then we're going to do itemF.parent is equal to itemSample.parent. And this is because when you run the clone function on any instance, it by default sets the parent of that new instance to nil. And so we're going to need to manually set that parent back to the same parent of this item. And then itemF.visible is equal to true, because if we remember, we set the sample to be invisible, and so when we clone it, it's going to clone that as well. We set it to be invisible up here, so since it's going to be invisible, then we want to make sure we set it to visible as well, so that way we can actually see it. Okay, so now that we have this, we're just going to test this and just see what it looks like, right? And there's no errors in the output, so that's good. If we open the bag, we see nothing. Right, so this is because we are not actually running this function. So we need to actually run this function first. So at the very start of the game, I didn't mean to add that. At the very start of the game, after we update the inventory data, we're going to do inventory client.update the display as well. And so now at the very start of the game, it's going to update the data, it's going to get the data from the server, and then it's going to update the display to match that new data. And we're also going to need to run the update display function later on as well. So we can see we have an error here. And that is because I am referencing the wrong things. So itemF, this is going to be a clone of the sample, .item count rather than just regular count. So item count .text because it's a text label. So that was a little tap on my end, and that should be good now. Okay, now if we open our inventory, you can see a bunch of things. Now none of them seem to have anything on them, but I think that's because we didn't name any of them or give them any images, if I'm not mistaken. Then just to test that the count text works properly, we're going to go ahead and in the starter pack, we're just going to duplicate the rock a bunch of times using Control+D. So now if we run it again, we can see that this one has 5 times instead of 1 time. So this one's most like the rock stack. But now we're going to add some images to each of those items just so we can kind of tell which one's which, right? So I'm going to remove all those duplicates just so I can only have one that I have to change. And in order to change the image, we're going to have to change the texture ID property right here. Because if you remember inventory server, when it creates the stack, it gets the image from texture ID and it gets the description from the tooltip property right here. So we're going to change the tooltips and the texture ID for all of the tools. Okay, so now I have added images and tooltips to all of these items. The tooltips we won't be able to see yet because we haven't set up the item info frame. But now we should be able to see the images if we run it again. You can see each of these has images now. And one thing you'll probably notice that we switch to the server side and go to the backpack. If we duplicate a bunch of stuff, right, to get more items in the backpack, you notice it doesn't update here, and that's because we haven't actually set it to run the update display function more than just at the beginning of the game. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to stay in the inventory client where we've been working for a bit, and we're going to create a new section underneath the updating inventory for the first time, and we're going to connect some signals from the signal module. Signal.listen remote. So we're going to listen to a fire from the server, and we're going to listen for like when we need to actually update the display if there's like a new item or anything, right? So we're going to call this, we're going to set the key as inventory client update. And the reason I'm calling it update rather than update display is because we also want to update the inventory data as well. And we're just going to do that all in one little function that we're just going to create here. So function new data types.inventory, and then we're going to do inventory client.inData equals new data, inventory client.update display, and that should be it. So now anytime if we fire this from the server, it should update all the data on the client and also update the display. So that makes it really easy to then go on the server. Since we already have the signal module required, now we can just do anytime we have any sort of change to the inventory, we can just update the client side, right? So if I do in register item at the very bottom, updating client, signal.fire client, inventory client :update. Then we can just copy this, add it in unregistered item, add it in equip the hotbar, add it in unequipped from hotbar, and that should be it. And then one thing I forgot to add, we're going to run this function, but we also need to provide the inventory data. As you notice, I added a parameter here for the new inventory data, and the reason I did that because alternatively I could just do inventory client.update inventory data, right? But the issue with that is then we have the server fires the client to update the data, which then fires the server again, which then comes back to the client. And so it's going back and forth when it doesn't need to. So instead, it makes more sense to just directly get the data from when we first fire this from the server. So anytime we run this signal fire client, we're going to put comma and then env for the inventory data. And that's just coming from the variable reference we already have. And so that should be 4 different places that you're firing that in total. One in each of the hotbar functions, one in the register and unregister. And so now we get an error, so we're going to fix that. Right, so the issue here is that I also forgot that when we're doing fire client, when we're firing the client from the server, we also need to specify what client we're firing, and that's going to be the first thing we need to specify. So we're just going to add player right there as the first argument. And that's also just coming from the parameter that we already have here. So now that should work. So now if we look in our inventory, we can see all the items. If we go to the server side, and it's important that you go to the server side to do this, otherwise it won't work. And then we duplicate the rock a bunch of times. Now we can see it actually updates as we do that. And we can do that with any of the other items too. And we notice with the chest plate, it creates new stacks of it too, because it can only stack up to 1. And then one thing I'm going to change here, just kind of as like a preference thing, is if items only have one, or if a stack only has 1 item, I don't want it to show this the text for how many items it has. I just kind of want that to not be visible, and I only want that to be visible if there's more than 1 item. And so in order to do that, it's going to be fairly simple. We're going to go to the inventory client, and then we're going to go to the update display function. We're going to go inside here where we create each new item. And we're going to do if stack data dot items, if number of stack data dot items is equal to 1, then item f dot count visible, or item f dot item count visible equals false. And so if there's only 1 item, we make the item count text invisible. So now you notice now none of them have the item count text. But then if we go to the server and we duplicate the rock, now you can see that one has it. Alright, so since my voice is getting tired and this video is nearing pretty long, then I'm going to end this episode here, but I appreciate you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. In the next episode, hopefully we should be able to set up the item info portion, so we can actually select an item and it'll show info for that item, and also potentially the hotbar portion, so we can actually show the currently equipped items on the hotbar, right? And that should be everything we'll probably get to next episode. But anyway, as usual, if you want access to the files for any of my tutorial videos, such as this one, or any of my tutorial series or anything, then you can get access to those with the $299 a month membership on either YouTube or Patreon. And if you're interested in one-on-one tutoring with me, then you can check out the 3 higher tiers for different amounts of hours per month. And I can help you with your own projects in a one-on-one setting, maybe in like a voice call or whatever else you prefer. Either way though, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed.